In the past year or so, I've heard Hillary Clinton making excuses for the notable lack of progress the economy has made in the 8 years of the Obama administration. Those excuses usually revolve around an assertion that if it hadn't been for President Obama and his administration, America would probably have fallen into a Great Depression because of the absolutely horrible mess that George Bush left us in. The irony of Secretary Clinton being able to say that and get away with it is staggering. It was her husband and his administration that set the stage for the banking crisis and the mess that we found ourselves in back in 2008. Back then, my nephew asked me what I thought was going to happen with the banking crisis. I'll tell you a little story. It's the story I told my nephew. It does a pretty good job of describing what really happened and why it happened. Back in the 1960s, I decided to start a business. I was going to build factories and either rent them out or sell them. I had very little money and I knew practically nothing. I would go into banks with my best suit and my best English and tell them I needed money to start a business. They'd practically throw me out of the place. It was about that time that I was introduced to the saying that banks only lend money to people who don't need it. But I was determined. I began saving every cent I could. I sold my new car and put the money in the bank. I bought a $75 Rambler station wagon. After a number of years working as a heavy equipment operator in the warm weather, substitute teaching in the Chicago high schools in the cold weather, trying to sell vacuum cleaners at night, and renting a place to live in a friend's mom's basement, I accumulated about $10,000. I bought 2 industrial lots by Crystal Lake Airport for about $4,500, and I just decided to go ahead and start, without a loan. I was dumb, energetic, and determined. Nothing was going to stand in my way. There was a contractor who owed me money but couldn't pay me. He did, however, have heavy equipment, concrete forms, and a truck. I told him that if he can't pay me my money, he should let me use his equipment. I bought a surveyor's transit from Sears for $119, and I got a cheap architect to design a building for me for $100, and I started. I did my own surveying, dug the foundation with the guy's front end loader, erected the forms, poured the concrete, all by myself. I had a pretty good start on the building and hadn't yet run out of money. One day I went into Cary State Bank, the community bank down the street, to get something notarized. I was covered with mud and had a raggedy old winter jacket on. After I finished with the notary, I asked her, almost as an afterthought, if this bank made industrial construction loans. She said yes. I told her I had about $45,000 worth of industrial building completed in Crystal Lake, and I think I may need around $35,000 more to complete it. She said, let me get the vice president. The vice president came out and said, step right into my office, Mr. Larson. I could hardly believe it. I can still remember feeling very uncomfortable walking into his beautifully carpeted office with dried mud cracking off of me and falling onto the carpet. He asked me to tell him about my project. When I finished, he said that they'd be glad to make me a loan. And in fact, why don't we make the loan for $45,000 instead of $35,000? He told me I didn't have to use it all, just what I needed. That way I wouldn't have to pay interest on any more than I used, but the paperwork would already be in place should I need a little more to complete the project. They even gave me the loan at prime. Prime is the rate that banks loan money to other banks. At the time, it was 6%. His name was Don DeRate. He was a nice guy. It was a tremendous lesson and something that helped me the rest of my business life. I began to realize that banks and lending institutions have a responsibility to their depositors, a responsibility to do the very best they can to take care of their depositors' money, to make it safe, and to make it earn for the bank and for those depositors. Even though I was full of mud, this time I represented a loan package where the bank's money was safe because I was asking for less money than the collateral that I was offering was worth. They couldn't lose. Their depositors and stockholders' money would be safe. In the late 70s, President Jimmy Carter made some well-intentioned moves to try to bring poor folks, especially blacks, and to the middle class by helping them realize the American dream of home ownership. They called it the Community Reinvestment Act. In the mid-90s, President Clinton pursued the goals of the Community Reinvestment Act more aggressively. It was based on the idea that if more minorities owned homes, the pride of ownership would motivate them to work hard and better themselves in order to hold on to something that was now theirs, their own home. This is a simplified description of the unintended consequences that evolved from those worthwhile goals. Government began pressuring banks and lending institutions into making loans to folks who had very little collateral, where there was a much greater chance of default. When I saw this happening, I can remember thinking that this was putting these banks, these privately owned businesses, in a position that was counter to the principle of protecting themselves and their depositors. This could really backfire on them. When I was that young guy going into banks with my best suit and my best English, they didn't throw me out because they didn't like me. They threw me out because I had no collateral. They threw me out because it would have been poor business practice to give me a loan. They threw me out because not doing so would not be meeting their fiduciary responsibility to their depositors, which is to protect those depositors' money. When government pressured banks to make these loans, they were forcing them into a position of doing something against their own self-interest. At some point, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac came on the scene. They were unclear mixtures of private business and government. Because government was involved, there was a tacit understanding that somehow or another, if these Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac loans defaulted, government would stand behind them. President Clinton, with the help of his Treasury Secretary Rubin, expanded dramatically this policy of making loans to folks who were, from a business standpoint, poor risks. Democrats in Congress, especially Chris Dodd and Barney Frank, but also Jamie Gorelick, Maxine Waters, and many others, began accusing lending institutions who resisted making these high-risk loans of redlining. Redlining was the practice of avoiding making loans in poorer areas. These poor areas were often black. They basically accused them of racism. A couple of things began to happen. First of all, if you tell a man that he has to do something that is self-destructive, he's not going to feel a hell of a lot of obligation to be as enthusiastic about your plans for him as you are. And secondly, he's going to try to figure out a way he can cover his butt while you make him work against himself. So a lot of these private banks began the practice of getting rid of these poor loans as fast as they could. They'd bundle them into packages and sell them to other lending institutions or mutual funds or any way they could figure out to get rid of them. They'd come up with names for them like mortgage-backed securities or something like that. Pardon me. The practice has always reminded me of trash compactors. Pardon me. If you have a pile of garbage on the kitchen floor, it looks terrible. If you put the pile of garbage into a trash compactor, what comes out doesn't look so bad, but it's still garbage. Democrats in Congress began to insist that Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae begin increasing their percentage of poorly collateralized loans in poor areas to close to 50% of their total loan packages. Something else began evolving with some of the folks who were running Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. That was the practice of making as many of these loans to poor folks as they possibly could, because the more loans they made, the greater their bonuses. I've read that some folks that were given loans didn't even have jobs. Early on in George Bush's presidency, he and his administration went to Congress and said, in essence, that this is a powder keg, and we really should do something about it. I think it was 2003 or so. Democrats in Congress said Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are healthy and, in essence, accused the Bush administration of racism, and the Bush administration backed off. Somewhere around late 2004 or 2005, John McCain went to Congress and also said that this is a powder keg and we had better do something about it. He was told by Democrats in Congress that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are healthy and implied that any attempt to cut back on this successful program was racism. McCain and those Republicans backed off. You know, you can employ crappy business practices just so long and get away with it. Eventually, the shit will hit the fan. Well, in 2008, the shit finally did hit the fan. But make no mistake, the shit hit the fan because of what government initiated, a well-intentioned but poorly thought-out plan that carried with it all kinds of unintended consequences. Senator Chris Dodd was quick to state, "There would be time to assess blame. We must first do what's necessary to resolve this crisis." Republicans made the mistake of allowing that to stand. Big mistake. So Chris Dodd and Barney Frank and the rest of the politicians who caused this situation in the first place then began saying that because of the past 8 years of Bush's failed policies, we find ourselves in this mess. Democrats and the media then began defining the causes of the banking crisis in such a way as to lay the blame at the feet of George Bush and the banks. Not only was that not true, but we are still suffering with the results of everyone assuming that it was true. And all discussions on the subject start with that assumption. Democrats are almost always better politicians than Republicans. The degree of injustice of these smug, self-satisfied people saying this and getting away with it is staggering. For our media to cover aspects of the bailout, but this one. For the media to cover every aspect of the bailout, but this one, gives lie to their claim of objectivity. For the media to ignore what started the whole mess and only concentrate on the greed that stemmed from it is telling only part of the story. You know who the media is, don't you? They're the folks who are supposed to keep government honest and the public informed. For them not to tell all of the story is a disservice to society and makes it more difficult for that society to make informed decisions. When my nephew asked me back in 2008 what I thought was going to happen with the banking crisis, I also told him this. It depends on what they do from here. If government continues to force lending institutions into any kind of self-destructive, unsound business practices, we'll be in even bigger trouble than we are now. Politicians and government, even though they may have been well-intentioned, have put us into a situation where there are no good solutions. We have been put there by politicians who, for the most part, have never been in business, who have never had to create wealth, and as a result, don't know how it's done, or just how difficult it is to do, and just how many fail in the process of trying. Most wouldn't know a sound business practice if they fell over it. Many politicians go into law school and then straight into politics. Most have pretty much concentrated on learning what it takes to get reelected. They've never been attentive enough to notice what makes America the great country it is. What has made America so rich that it can be more generous to other nations than any other nation in the history of the world. It's freedom, capitalism, the rule of law, and business. America could be generous to other nations because it could afford to be. Where would people be if they didn't have some place to work? If there had never been someone who risked everything he had, worked his butt off to start a business, and made a success of it, where do they think we would all be? If there was no such thing as business, how rich do you think America would be? For government, or anyone else, to see business as the enemy is to see the goose that lays golden eggs as the enemy. I believe government had to step in back in 2008 with some sort of a bank rescue plan to keep the banking system working. Much of the rest of the business world is dependent on that sound banking system, and a banking system can only work if people trust it. The plan seemed to be evolving into some sort of a purchase of failing entities and loans that may, at some point, enable the selling of those entities and loans for a profit when the pendulum of the marketplace swings back in the other direction. I know, I said politicians wouldn't know sound business practice if they fell over it. That's true. So the likelihood that they'd pull it off without screwing it up was and is remote. But this is the bottom line. If government does not stop making bankers and other business people employ poor business practices, their plans will continue to be short-sighted, and the unintended consequences that can stem from forcing people to do things counter to their own well-being can backfire, as we've seen. and be far more reaching than anyone would have dreamed. There was one more thing that government did during that time in the 1990s. They passed the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. I think that's what it was called. It repealed Glass-Steagall. That allowed these community banks to merge with Wall Street investment banks. As I recall, it was initiated by a Republican and a Democrat. I believe that was a mistake. Community banks tend to be conservative and careful. That's the kind of bank I went to. The Wall Street guys tend to be gamblers. Taxpayers insuring against the failure of a conservative community bank is one thing. Taxpayers assuring against the failure of what are all too often a bunch of gamblers is entirely another thing. So Hillary's comments pretty much show a lack of understanding of how the marketplace works. Of course, that makes sense. After all, she's a politician, not a business person. Maybe what we need is somebody who had a great deal of success in business. Let's see, who could we get?